this computer. All right, we be recording. So I guess this is our third Zoom session for 240. What we're covering today is practice with input-output functions, and it's the very tail end of Unit 1. Next week we will focus on the two types of compression, output limiting compression and WDRC. But right now I will share screen. And we will go to what we have here. I will pull up a PowerPoint, and I will also pull up our good old notes here. This here be what we be covering today. Practice with input-output functions. I guess we're looking at pages 205 to 208 in that updated textbook. And these are actually questions that are found at the end of the chapter. And I believe it's chapter 7, which covers compression per se. Gosh, I wrote the book, but I can't remember anymore. I do think it's chapter 7, yes. Anyway, it's at the tail end of chapter 7. There's some practice questions, and those are the ones that we're going over today. So when people have really looked at input-output functions, you've got a couple of practice questions on it. And I really want to stress here, and I'm graying this here, input-output functions are the language of compression. If you talk to any hearing aid manufacturer, any sales representative from a hearing aid manufacturer, they all have to learn the input-output functions because they have to describe the hearing aids that are being sold. They have to describe these hearing aids to the audiologists and HISs who are fitting them. So always remember, like as the hearing aid manufacturers sell to you, and then you turn around and sell to the end user or customer. So you don't need to explain this to your customers at all or your clients, but the representatives often explain this to you. So that's why it's quite important to have a handle on the, a grip on the handle of compression there. This is found on all fitting software. Mind you, you're not always using these when you're fitting software. You're usually using frequency responses. You can look at the horizontal axis will be frequency and the vertical axis will be amplitude, and you're looking at what the hearing aid is doing, basically a spectrum. That's what you're doing, mostly. That's what you're going to see on hearing aid specs. The gain and the maximum power output, and that's what you'll see. You're not usually working directly with input-output functions. Where you will see them is if you uncover them in the software. They're usually buried as a second layer, more for nerds, okay? But it's still, you still have to kind of know what they are. So input is always on the horizontal axis. Output is always on the vertical axis. Increases to input result in corresponding increases to output. Yup. But are they 1-to-1, linear, or are they compression? 2-to-1, 4-to-1, 10-to-1, etc. That's what we'll look at today. Frequency is not represented on input-output functions. You won't see hertz. It's just not there. Frequency is because the axes are input and output. Where's frequency? Well, frequency is just a slice. So frequency is just usually understood to be 2000 hertz. Usually the input-output function represents what the hearing aid is doing at 2000 hertz. And the reason why is because 2000 hertz is the frequency that's most useful for understanding what the words are. It's where vowels and consonants meet. It's the frequency. If you take 500, 1000, 2000, and 4000, of those four, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's Luke. It's 2000 hertz. That's the most vital. So that's why ANSI has specified that input-output functions represent what the hearing aid's doing at 2000 hertz. You can find input-output functions for other frequencies, but the default is 2000 hertz. Okay? So when we take a look at the questions at the tail end of chapter 7, and you'll see these 10 questions. That's what we're doing here. Okay, so we'll just start out looking at these. A compression hearing aid provides, take question 4, 90 dB SPL output with 40 dB SPL input. What's the gain here? So how would you figure that out?
50.
50, of course.
Yeah.
Minus input is gain.
40. Yeah, 90 minus 40, you know, that's...
Correct. Okay, so we'll just take a look, see. All right. Pulling up this here slide, looking at what we saw last week. You can see linear gain on the left. You'll see output limiting compression in red. You'll see another type of output limiting compression in sort of a, whatever you call it, an orangish whatever. And then you'll see wide dynamic range compression on the far right. And I put these 4 examples here. I have them listed from left to right, almost in order in which they developed historically. Linear was first, then came output limiting, and then came WDRC. Output limiting emerged in the mid 1980s. Wide dynamic range compression emerged in the 90s. And it emerged when the knowledge of outer hair cells became distinct from that of inner hair cells. It's also when otoacoustic emissions began to be done by clinicians, because we figured out that the outer hair cells help inner hair cells pick up soft sounds. So with outer hair cell damage, let's have a type of compression that imitates what the outer hair cells used to do. And that's exactly what wide dynamic range compression does. It imitates outer hair cells. The focus is on providing, and if you look carefully here where my cursor is, the focus is on providing linear gain, read most gain, for soft inputs. So if I pull this up here and we take a look at the far right column, for these soft inputs above the asterisk, that's where the gain is maximum. And if you go past the knee point, now the gain slowly goes down, and it goes down at a ratio of 2 to 1. As the inputs increase by 10, the outputs increase by only 5. So it's a slow reduction of gain. Like Mrs. Jones seeing the stop sign way at the end of the road and slowly putting on the brakes way ahead of time, pissing off everyone behind her. Now, if you look at these 2 middle columns, you're going to see they're both output limiting. And look at the ratios here, 10 to 1 and 20 to 1. Like the far right column, and like the one in black too, most gain is provided for the softer inputs, but the gain is the same for not only soft inputs, but also for mid inputs. Look at this, 40, 50, and 60. So the knee point is higher. In other words, the hearing aid waits longer to go into compression. And when it decides to go into compression, however, then it really goes into compression. So the focus of the compression is on the loud sounds. Whereas with WDRC, the focus of compression is on medium and soft sounds. A weak degree of compression is provided for medium and loud inputs. Whereas with output limiting, a strong degree of compression is provided for what? Only loud inputs. But here's something I want to draw your attention to. It's like the law of diminishing returns. Think about yourself standing a yard from a wall, and then you cut the distance to 18 inches. So now you're 18 inches from the wall instead of being 36 inches from the wall. And now cut that distance in half again. Now you're 9 inches from the wall. And now cut it in half again. Now you're 4.5 inches from the wall. And cut that in half again, and now you're 2 and whatever inches from the wall. And keep cutting the distance in half. Guess what? You'll never reach the wall. Okay? You'll never reach the wall. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that there's very little difference between 10 to 1 and 20 to 1 compression. As the compression ratios increase, the differences between the ratios becomes less and less and less. Look at the 2 middle columns. Look at 70. at the red column of 10 to 1. With 70 in, 121 out, my gain is 51. Now look at the next column, the third one, the kind of the orangish column. Look at 70 here. With 70 in, my output's 120.5 decibels. Well, what's the difference? Look, the gain is 50.5. Big, hairy deal. You know what I'm saying? The difference between 10 to 1 and 20 to 1 is tiny. The difference, however, between 1 to 1 and 2 to 1 is quite big. And 2 to 1 to 4 to 1 is, there's a difference, but it's less of a difference. And 4 to 1 to 10 to 1, you know, or whatever, there's less of a difference. And 10 to 1 to 20 to 1, there's barely any difference. So I guess what I'm asking you to do is to look at these two middle columns and look at the resulting gain in the from here, 51 down to 24 here, or 50.5 down to 22. Hardly any difference. Okay, that's what I'm trying to draw your attention to. Now let's look at these questions. The questions 4 to 6 at the end of chapter 7. Here we have a compression hearing aid provides 90 dB SPL output with 40 dB SPL input. What's the gain here? And Kelly said 50. Well, yeah, it's true. 90 SPL output minus 50 dB SPL 40 input. Input plus gain is output. Output minus input is gain. Okay, take the same hearing aid now, very same hearing aid. Now we're saying its knee point is at 50. Its compression ratio is 2 to 1. And the output for a 60 dB SPL input is. So here we go. How would you figure that out? So you're looking at this. The way to figure it out is usually to draw a graph, draw the picture. And I always do that. I always draw the picture and look at it. So it's the same hearing aid. You looked at number 4. A hearing aid provides 90 dB SPL output with 40 in. What's the gain? 50. Same hearing aid. Knee points at 50. So what's happening between 0 dB SPL inputs and 50 dB SPL inputs? The same thing. It's linear gain. 0 in is going to be 50 out because, hey, look at this. 40 in was 90 out. So 0 in is going to be 50 out. 10 in is going to be 60 out. 70 in is going to be whatever. You're going to just keep working it all up until you get to 40. That's going to be 90. So let's look at the picture. Here we go. This is how you draw it. This is how you figure it out. Because we said 40 in was 90 out. And then the next question said, okay, same hearing aid, make the knee point at 50. Compression ratio is 2 to 1. Output for a 60 dB SPL input is, and again, focus like this. If 40 in was 90 out, then that means 50 dB of gain. So 0 in would be 50 out. 10 in would be 60 out. 20 in would be 70 out. 30 in would be 80 out. 40 in would be 90 out. 50 in would be 100 out. So let's do it. There it is. So the trick is, and I think as Kelly said, make the bottom corner show that gain. 0 in was 50 out. And then just draw 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 out to 100 on your horizontal axis. And then on your vertical axis, make things make sense. So now you're making a 45-degree angle line up from the left corner, up to your knee point. There's your knee point, right above 50. So that 50 in is reading 100 out. Just like 40 in is reading 90 out, because question 5 says same hearing aid. And now you're making the compression ratio 2 to 1. So now your 60 in is going to be 105 out. My input went up by 10, but my output only increased by 5. And now 70 in is 110 out, if you can see that. Make sense? All right. So now let's go to question. Let's answer the question. Knee point is at 50. Compression ratio of 2 to 1. Output for a 60 dB SPL input is?
110.
Look at the graph. 60 in. What's my output?
110.
Read the graph. It's not 110. 105.
Oh,
Look at the
105.
graph.
Oh,
Yep.
sorry. Yeah, yep, you're right. There's
No
only
worries. Yep. This is what I mean. That's why we're doing practice, because this is all. That's what it's all about.
Yeah,
I mean, if you knew all of it, you wouldn't be here. So this is the idea. Okay. Previous. Let's go to the previous slide. All right. Same hearing aid, number 6. Same hearing aid. Knee points at 50. Compression ratio is the same, 2 to 1. What's the gain for a 60 dB SPL input? The gain now, not the output, the gain.
55.
Correct. 105 minus 60 is 55. I guess. No, let's see.
No, 45.
45.
45.
Correct. There we go.
So you had the 50 gain, and as you go on this compression,
Yep.
you're basically taking the 50 minus 5, then the
Yep.
50 minus 10, then the 50 minus 15.
Yep.
So basically it's for every
Yep.
10, you're taking away 5 from that 50.
Yeah, or put it this way, Kelly. For every 10 that my input increases, my output only increases by 5.
But you don't still have that 50 though.
No.
No.
That's why
Yeah.
you don't. Your gain goes down.
Yeah.
As my input increases by 10, my corresponding output increases by 5. So it's a 10 to 5 ratio or 2 to 1.
But
And then to figure out the gain, you're just taking that resultant output and minusing the input, and that's your gain.
But here it does show 55. If you go on the 60 line, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 5.
Where are you working from here? 60 in?
Yeah, 10, 20, 30, 40, 55 is what I show as the gain.
Okay, where is it? Okay, look at 60. Okay, do you see
So
my
you go-
arrow?
So you
Okay,
go
now
10, 20,
go left.
30, 40, 50.
Go
Right.
left.
105. I got that, 105.
Okay,
But
what's one?
I'm counting up from the bottom on the 60. Don't you count up 10?
No.
5? No?
Nope, you just look at, you let the graph tell you. You let the graph talk to you. No, always just, if 60 was in and 105 is out,
Right.
gain is the difference between the two.
So it's not anything to do with this line from 60 up to the 105.
From 60 to the 105.
If you go up the one, like all these others, you could count on like say 40. Okay, just go to the 40. 10, 20, 30, 40. And then the 50, and then you took the 90, that was the 50. Minus was 50. Okay, so maybe that's where I'm confused here. So
that's it. This is all good. Look at it this way.
Okay, so that's it. Okay, so okay. So
10 in is 60 out.
Okay, I got it.
Minus 10 is 50. And the same story holds true all the way from the bottom left up to the knee point. At the knee point, things change.
Right. So now we can just go 10, 20, 30, 40, 55 minus 105. 105 minus your 55 would be your...
I'm not sure where you're going there. I always said that's what's mixing me up. I just let the graph talk to you. Just say, look, watch my arrow, watch my cursor. 60 in is 105 out.
Right.
Well, I guess 105 minus 60 is 45. Done. Just let the graph tell the story. Now 70. 70 in, watch my cursor, is 110 out. 110 minus 70 is 40. 80 in. So follow my cursor. 80 in is 115 out. 115 minus 80 is 35. So if you look at the next picture, look at the table here. This table refers to the previous slide. So this table is this. So let's talk about it here. Here we go. You have input, output, gain. So if you look at what your input is, output was 50, my gain was 50. Input 10, my output was 60, my gain is 50. 20 in, 70 out, my gain is 50. 30 in, 80 out, my gain is 50. 40 in, 90 out, my gain is 50. This is the story of this line. So what we talked about is what's happening right there. Now let's go where the things are underlined. And I underlined them to show you now you've got compression. Now you've hit the knee point. At 50, you hit the knee point, which is right here. So now you're at an input of 50. So now let's look at what happened at 50. Same thing, 50, 100 in, or I should say 50 in was 100 out, gain of 50. And stay with me here, look at the slide. 50 in was 100 out, so my gain is still 50, but now the proverbial crap hits the fan. 60 in was 105 out, the difference is 45. 70 in, 110 out, the difference is 40. 80 in, 115, the difference is 35. 90 in, 120, the difference is 30. 100 in, 125 out, the difference is 25. Let's look at 100. Let's look at that. The bottom one right here, go up here. 100 in was 125 out. 125 up minus 100 is 25. Practice reading input-output functions. Really glad we're doing this. Yeah, there we go. How are you doing so far?
Okay, I think I got it now. I think the best way to do it is just say, okay, 100 in, you got 125 out. What's the difference in 100 and 125?
Correct. That's always what you do.
Yeah.
Always, always, always.
Not counting these squares.
No, do not count the squares. Nope, do not count the squares. Oh, that's why I always tell, let the graph tell the story. Let it be in control.
That's only for a 40 dB input, right?
Correct. Say that again.
That's only for a 40 dB input, though, right? It changes if the input
yeah, watch this. Oh, absolutely. Watch. We're going to change screen now. We're going to go to a different one. What the hey? Let's see this now. Let's go to another one. Here we go. Different situation. Okay, we're going to a new graph, a new hearing aid, a different hearing aid. Question number 7. A compression hearing aid provides 120 dB SPL output with a 50 dB SPL input. What's the gain here?
7.
Correct.
7.
Yeah, 50 plus 70 is 120. Done. Next. Same hearing aid. Knee points at 70. Compression ratio is 10 to 1. Output for an 80 dB SPL input is, so I look at that and go, oh my God. How do you answer that? Well, draw the graph. Literally take a pencil, take a paper, and draw it. And when you draw it, you can figure it out. So look at this, 120 in, I should say 50 in was 120 out. And then you know that the gain there is linear because your knee point is at 70 and everything below 70 is linear, right? So now since you know your gain is 70, then on your graph, make the 0 on the horizontal line correspond with 70 on the vertical line, much like this. Here you go, draw it. You just make 0 in over here. You make the corner 0 and 70. Cool. Now you can proceed and figure out what's going on. Because we said that the knee point's at 70, right? So let's go to let's go here, knee point, question 8 says the knee point's at 70. So you know the gain is linear for 0 inputs, 10 inputs, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. The gain is a 45-degree angle line. It's linear, tit for tat, linear, linear, linear. Everything below 70, so it means your 45-degree angle line is going to be long. Yep, look at it. So it's linear gain for all these inputs. Da-da, 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 da-da. As my inputs go up by 10, my outputs go up by 10. And the difference between them is 70. So it's 70 dB gain for all of these inputs until the knee point. Boom, here we go. 70 in. What's the output? I'm going to ask you.
Oh, it's 70 in. It's 100 and it's 140 is the output.
Oh, kidding! What a terrible hearing aid. That'll blast
No,
someone.
it's like I'm like you're going to make the person deaf.
No kidding. And I'm just making a fictitious example. The purpose is to get you to read the input-output graphs, but absolutely that would be insane.
Yeah.
It blasts someone to kingdom come. So anyway, nonetheless, looking at the story, we'll pretend we're fitting a gorilla, okay?
Okay.
So here you go. Now, with 80 in, what do you think the output is here?
141, because at 10 to 1, it's a one increase for every 10 increase.
Yes.
Okay.
Compression ratios, the first number represents increases to input. The second number represents increases to output. The corresponding increases to output. So if my input went from 70 to 80, my output only increased 141. What's going to be my output, or I should say then, what's going to be my output for a 90 input?
142.
Yeah, good. We're all good here? Makes sense. So let's go and look at the previous picture here. Compression ratio of 10 to 1. An output for an 80 dB SPL input is 141. Now let's look at question 9, or I'll just make sure, 141, 80 in, 141, okay, over here. Now back to the previous slide, answer question number 9. Same hearing aid, knee points at 70, compression ratio of 10 to 1, nothing's changed. Output for a 90 dB SPL input is, and as you correctly said, 142. But now I'm going to ask you to tell me what would be the gain for an input of 80. Here's 80 in, 141 out. What's the gain?
61.
I guess so. It's going to be 141 minus 80.
No, 59. Sorry.
I guess. Whatever the difference is between 141 and 80.
1 and 80. No, 61.
Okay, there you go. What's the gain for a 90 dB input?
52.
There you go. Let's see what happens. Let's go to the next slide. Here you go. This is the table that'll give you the answer, and you're right. But look and see how the gain just goes down dramatically, like you're going down by 10 dB almost, like 9 dB. You're going down by 9 dB for each. So as the inputs increase by 10, my outputs are only going up by 1. So my gain is...
On a hearing aid, can you really notice a 1 dB increase? I mean,
no.
I don't know.
No, you don't, Kelly, and that's why this hearing aid was an imitation of linear peak clipping. That's why. Instead of limiting the maximum power output by means of like literally stopping the speaker cone from moving, by instead of doing that, this is like a river with a huge rapids going against it. You're almost doing the same thing. You're slowing things down, but you're doing it without peak clipping. You're doing it by compression. So yep, you'd barely notice the output increase. It's like slamming on the brakes. It's like the output barely increases at all. There's a little bit of a tilt to the line, so there's a little bit of give, but basically this is a hearing aid that compression is slamming on the brakes.
So this is basically so that they don't have distortion, or to help the distortion.
Correct. It limits the MPO without distortion. Correct. That's the idea of it. Fighting cavities was the whole idea behind Crest, and limiting the maximum power output is the whole idea between output limiting compression. We're good. This is good. All right. Now, the big story here. Let's see if we can handle question 10. So here's your summary table of this particular slide and these questions. Okay. So here's your summary table, knee point 70, compression ratio 10:1, and here's what you two gave as your answers here, the decrease in gain, all that's done. Now so we've discussed in blue here, this is WDRC, and in red here, this is compression output limiting. And it doesn't have to be like this. It could be a different gain. I mean, it can be a different hearing aid, but the concepts are the same. Notice the two things that make the difference here between this graph and this graph. There's two things to notice. This one's WDRC. It has a low knee point and a low compression ratio. It's Mrs. Jones putting on the brakes slowly, way ahead of the stop sign. The focus here is the floor, providing maximum read linear gain for soft inputs, and then gradually reducing the gain for louder inputs. Looking at the summary table, a moderate amount of gain, but read the maximum gain in this particular hearing aid. It's a weaker hearing aid. It's not meant to be powerful. It's meant for sensory hearing loss, outer hair cell pathology. It's the most common pathology, and WDRC is by far the most common compression. So it's reading its maximum gain, albeit not much, it's only 50, is being gradually reduced. See that? Whereas this one, two things are different. Higher knee point, higher ratio. It waits to go into compression and then it slams on the brakes. So here is the ceiling, limiting the ceiling. Instead of providing maximum gain for soft sounds, this is providing maximum gain for soft and medium sounds, but this is meant for a high power hearing aid. This is meant for someone with inner and outer hair cell damage. This is meant for someone with severe hearing loss. Outer hair cell damage gives you moderate hearing loss. When you've got severe 80 decibel sensory neural hearing loss, you've got inner and outer pathology. And so you're going to focus on output limiting compression. That's basically going to be your focus. That's what you want to do. Here's question 10, the last one. This is a trippy question. Have a read of this one. Have we taken a real ear measurement yet?
Not me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just give you an idea of what real ear measurement does and what it is. If I had one here in the room, I'd show you. I'd hook it on my ear and show you. But it's a loop hanging on your ear, and then it goes down to a wire into the computer. And then there's a tiny probe tube about, yay long, about 2.5 inches long. And the idea is to put that little probe tube in your ear canal all the way down to your drum, almost, just about touching the drum. You have to look through your otoscope and you're sliding this little tube in. And then you're going to hold that tube in place and you're going to put the hearing aid on top of that tube, so that the tube doesn't move.
So you test what the hearing aid's doing.
Yeah, and you're going to measure what the hearing. So let's say you're using NAL as a fitting method, or DSL as a fitting method, and you've binked in the guy's hearing loss into NOAA, and you've binked it in, and you've chosen your hearing aid. Okay, you're going to use an Oticon, for example, and you've picked your model, and then you've hit enter, and everything will. Okay, this is the gain you're going to get, and this is the ACPO you're going to get, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, you hit save because you want that. But then you're going to do real ear and say, did you really get that? Is that what's really happening?
Does it map it on that chart? Does it map it on the chart so you can see if it...
Yep, correct. Exactly.
Okay.
So the software predicts what you should be getting, and real ear verifies to prove that you're getting. Okay, that's the story. Just so you know, there's a lot of clinicians out there who don't use real ear. These are IHS graduates who took their state licensure exam and they done passed their ILE, their international licensing exam, and they took an ear mold impression. By gum, now they're a dispenser. That's what they're doing. They're just pushing buttons. They have no idea. They just worked in their dad's shop, and this is what you do, and you hit this and you push the button and you save it, and healed. Jesus, here's your hearing aid. They don't prove
that you got what it's supposed to do.
Yes.
And do they, okay, say it didn't do what it was supposed to do.
Then you're going to change the gain of the hearing aid until it does what you're supposed to do.
So the clinician is the one that actually changes it?
Yep, you do. Yep. So a good clinician will modify. In other words, you'll probably, if it's a brand new hearing aid wearer, you'll probably deliberately underfit. You'll have your target by NAL or DSL, but you're going to deliberately go, I'm going to go 5 decibels shy of that on purpose. And you're going to save the results, and you're going to print them up and put them in the guy's file, and you'll write down, I deliberately underfit, client is new user. After a couple of weeks, the guy comes in, how's the hearing aid, blah, 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 and then you might bump it up a couple dB, and then save that. But you've done real ear to look at it. You know exactly what's going on. Okay, so here we go. Share screen. Let's do number 10. It deals with real ear, but it deals with input-output functions. You are fitting a hearing aid. The knee point's at 40 dB SPL, and the compression ratio is 2:1. So it's probably a WDRC, isn't it? Low compression ratio. Usually WDRC is around 2:1, maybe 3:1. That's WDRC. You get more than that, you start getting into output limiting. Anyway, your probe tube mic, real ear system, doesn't work well for inputs below 50. Well, you know what? That's true in many cases. What is ambient room noise? Ambient room noise is about 40, isn't it? 40 dB SPL. If you're just quiet in your room, sitting there, just ambient noise is around 40, 35 to 40. So really, you're not measuring what the hearing aid's doing for really, really, really soft inputs. You're not. But at any rate, your probe tube real ear system doesn't work well for inputs below 50. From the output of for a 50 dB SPL input, the calculated gain is 30 dB. From the output for a 50 dB SPL input, the gain is 30. Now, what would be the output for a 50 dB input? If the gain is 30, what's the output?
Oh, but the knee point was 40. Okay.
No, but just answer this particular sentence right here. From the output for a 50 dB SPL input, the calculated gain is 30. So what is the output?
Approximately 80.
Yeah, I would say 80. Yep, yeah. You're right. Okay, now the question is, what would the gain be if you ran a curve using a 40 dB SPL input? And then hint, an input-output function can really help you here. So let's do that. We know that there's something about 30 for a 50 dB SPL input. We know that. We said 50 in is going to be 80 out, so my gain is going to be 30. So let's draw a graph. Whoops, here we go. We know that 50 in is 80 out. Look at here, follow my cursor. 50 in is 80 out. And then what did we say? The knee point is at 40. So if 50 in is 80. Someone's phone is ringing away. I can hear this.
My husband's called me 3 times. I don't know. It must be something important.
You may want to get it. I don't want to interrupt it.
Yeah, I'll call him here in a minute.
Okay. So you know that 50 in is 80 out, but you don't know where to draw your lines? Yeah, you do, because we said the knee point's at 40. Like it says right here, your knee point is at 40. And your compression ratio is 2:1. So you do have the hints to draw the graph. You're drawing 1:1, up to 40. And then from then on, you're making your compression ratio 2:1. So you know how to draw the lines because the question gave it away here. The knee point's at 40 and the ratio is 2:1. Okay, that's what it says. All you're trying to figure out is the numbers along the sides of the axes. Okay, well then 50 in is 80 out. So then you'd write 80 over here and you'd write 50 here. You see what I'm saying? First, pretend there's no numbers. You haven't got the numbers. It says the knee point's at 40. The ratio's 2:1. So you drew a vertical line, and you didn't have any numbers here. Now I'm going to have you focus on me really carefully. I'm going to stop sharing screen for a second so that you actually look at me while I'm saying this, okay? The first sentence said the knee point was at 40 and the ratio was 2:1. So you can draw a line like this, horizontal, vertical, and just make a 45-degree angle line, go, circle it, and then go on an angle of 2:1. You can just do that. And then you've done that, but you haven't got any numbers under your horizontal. You don't have any numbers under your vertical. You haven't got there yet. All you're doing is answering this very first sentence. Whoops. Come on, Ted. I know you can do it. There. The knee point is 40, and the compression ratio is 2:1. So all you're going to do is draw a vertical line, draw a horizontal line, make a thing go 45-degree angle, and put a 40 under it. There's your knee point. That's what the question said. And then you're going to draw more of a slope and say 2:1, and you'll write that over here. Because the gain was linear below the knee point, 1:1. It was 2:1 beyond the knee point. And now look at the second sentence. Your system doesn't work well for inputs below 50, but from the output for a 50 dB SPL input, the calculated gain is 30. Okay, back to your little picture here. So you're going to draw the next one as 50, because your knee point was at 40. You're already in compression territory, and you're going to go, okay, you'll draw the number 50 here and go up, up, up till you hit your line and go left, left, left. That's why I drew a little dotted line here, and you'll write down 80 because 50 in was 80 out. Okay, so now the last sentence of the question. What would the gain be if you ran a curve using 40? Well, back to your graph. 40 in then.
75.
Well, your output would be 75. That's correct. Your output would be 75. So for a 40 dB input, your output would be 75. As I went down by 10 dB, my output would decrease from 80 by only 5.
35.
Correct. So I would go, so my output for a 40 input would be 75. 75 minus 40 is 35. Done. But you did it using input-output function knowledge. This is a tricky question. This is a hard one. That's why I ended with this question.
So I'm confused. What would the gain if you ran a curve using
Okay. Let's look at the question here. You're fitting a hearing aid and the knee point is at 40. Compression ratio is 2:1.
I got that drawn here, and then I got my 50.
Yeah.
And I got my knee point, and then the 2:1.
Yeah.
Okay.
So from the output for a 50 dB SPL input, the calculated gain is 30. So now you said 50 in was 80 out because that question gave it away. It said the gain was 30 for an 50 dB input. The output was the gain was 30. So that must mean that for 50 in, the output was 80.
Oh,
because
so we're trying to go backwards?
Yes. Correct.
Figure out what this was?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
You're going backwards.
Because at a 2-to-1, you're at a 5 dB gain.
Yep.
Okay.
Your gain goes down by 5 dB. If my input decreased from 50 down to 40, my output would decrease from 80 down to 75.
Yeah.
50 minus 40 is 10. 80 minus 75 is 5. Okay? So if 50 in, 80 out, 40 in, 75 out. So look at the distance here is only 5, whereas the distance here is 10. So that's all. The question was meant to be a little bit tricky, but it's just making you work backwards. You're fitting a hearing aid, the knee point's at 40, the ratio's 2-to-1. So what did you draw first? You drew a diagonal line. You drew a knee point at 40. You went down at 40. You wrote the number 40 here and said, okay, that's my knee point. And then you made it compression from then on, 2-to-1. And then the question said, oh, well, the calculated gain for a 50 dB input was 30. So then you'd go, okay, you draw the number 50 over here, and you'd go up and you'd go left, and you'd say, well, if the gain was 30, the output has to be 80, because 50 and 30 is 80. So then it says, what would the gain be for a 40 dB SPL input? So you just let your graph tell the story. 40 in, it would have to be 75 out, because you're already in compression territory. If my gain went down, or if my output went down by 10, my input went down by 10, my output would only go down by 5. Admittedly, a tricky question, but nonetheless. All right, now let's get out of PowerPoint for a second here and look at our notes. All right, so we've now done this. Input-output functions are required for various types of compression. Again, I want to underline here. See where I'm graying this out? This is no longer an issue. So put a star on your notes by this and say, freak not out. Input and output compression used to exist in analog hearing aids. Okay? And basically, what they told you was what the volume control did in the circuit. That's what they told you. So when you look at the graph here, at the picture in PowerPoint, this is the story of what input versus output compression. You'll see a bunch of lines here. But what I want you to notice is this. When they used to talk about output compression, the volume control, okay, the thing you're turning, look what it changed, the gain. It didn't change the MPO. And if the hearing aid was input compression, volume control, you could see it changed both the gain and the MPO. That's all there is to it. But don't worry about it. It's no longer an issue. Today's digital hearing aids don't mess with it. This is what you might want to notice. Here you go. So focus on this graph, because the left is showing you the adjustment of output limiting compression, and the right is showing you the adjustment of wide dynamic range compression. We're showing you how these different ways compressions are adjusted. In other words, I'll stop sharing for a second. Let's say you're testing someone and his or her UCL, uncomfortable loudness level, is around 100. Let's say, okay, 100 dBHL. What did we say last week? Last week we said that if your UCL is around 100, what are you adding to it to set your maximum power output? What are you adding to it?
15?
Yeah, about that. 10 to 15, something like that, 15-ish. And the reason why is because you're testing under headphones in terms of dBHL, whereas hearing aids are measured in dBSPL. Okay? And remember the curve of hearing sensitivity? Remember we said that 0 dB on the audiogram, the flat line on the top of the audiogram, really, in all truth, represents different SPLs across the frequencies, doesn't it? Because if we sat in front of a speaker, or we even were tested under headphones, our ears are most sensitive to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 5, 1, 2, and 4. We are not naturally predisposed to hear 100 hertz very well. We can't hear 50 hertz very well. We can't hear 8,000 as well. We can't hear 6 as well. Our ears, because of the resonance of our ears. Okay, so that curve in 0 dB, that SPL curve, we don't want to mess with those different values all the time because that's a drag. So we want to call all that 0. So they build in the differences, the softest levels it takes to hear in dB SPL, they build those differences into the audiometer and it's calibrated. So that in all truth, 1,000 hertz is really a 0 dB at 1,000 hertz. 0 dB HL is really about 7 dB SPL. And 500 hertz at 0 dB HL is really about 12 dB SPL. And 125 hertz at 0 dB HL on the audiogram is really 25 dB SPL. Okay, those differences are built into your audiometer. That's why they're calculated. That's why they're calibrated every year. So the average of those differences is about 15. That's why when a UCL is around 100, you add about 15 to it to find out what your MPO is going to be. And that is why people can adjust the maximum output of compression, as you see on the left. Okay, so you can raise it. Let's pretend this is output limiting compression. Look at how it's got a fairly flat. It's really not 2 to 1. Let's pretend it's whatever. Who cares? You can raise or lower that on the software. I can raise it to I can put it at 115, I can put it at 110, 100, 130, 125. You're going to set it to where you, the clinician, think it should be set. Sometimes your software will automatically do this for you. Sometimes it won't. So just know, in theory, your MPO really should be around about 15 dB higher than your UCL, essentially. The right-hand graph, this shows you how WDRC is adjusted. And what you're doing with WDRC is you're adjusting the gain for soft inputs. You're talking about the floor. You're not worried about the ceiling. You don't care that much. Mrs. McGillicuddy with a 40 to 50 dB sensory neural loss isn't wearing a high power hearing aid. She's wearing a weaker hearing aid. So your concern isn't, oh, I better limit the maximum power because otherwise I'm going to make her more hard of hearing and everything. Of course you don't want the MPO to be really loud, but the focus is on how much gain do I want to give for soft sounds. And what's interesting here to note, okay, so it's easy to see more and less MPO on the left. That's easy. But which line here represents more gain for soft sounds? This is the trick. Look at this picture here. Is it this line or is it this line? Which one represents the most? The hostest with the mostest.
Wasn't it left was the most gain?
Yes, it is. Look at the picture here. This will show it to you. This picture just lays it out for you. If you look at the knee point here, or the knee point here, or the knee point here, just to give you an example, I could have figured it from anywhere, but let's look at the leftmost blue line, 45-degree angle line. Okay, linear gain, less linear gain, more linear gain. Look at it. 50 in this case was 90 out. What's the gain?
40.
40. Look at here. 70 in is 100 out. What's the gain?
30.
30. So the leftmost line represents the most linear gain. And don't even question why. Just let the graph tell the story. That's what I always take. Smoke a good one, or take a Zen Buddha pill, or whatever you want, but let the graph tell the story. Just back off and say, okay, well, if 50 in was 90 out, I guess the gain must be 40. Well, 70 in, the output's 100. I guess the gain must be 30. So I guess the right-hand line must mean less gain. And I guess this one must mean more gain. I guess. Must be. What's the compression ratio? Look at this. What's the compression ratio? Well, 50 in was 90 out. 60 in is 95 out.
2 to 1.
2 to 1.
2 to 1.
Snicker snack. You got it. Here we go. Let's look at another example. Here's another input-output functions, and you're looking at adjustments and crap like that. Which gain line represents the most? The most. Well, 50 in happened to be 95 out. What's the gain?
45.
Right.
45.
70 in was 100 out. What's the gain? 30. Okay, what's the compression ratio in this case? Well, as my input increased by 60, my output increased by only 2.5.
So is that 4 to 1?
Yeah,
Is that what
correct.
that was? Okay.
That's correct. 4
Wasn't
to
sure
1.
because you were saying, you know, if it was 4 for every 1, I was
Yeah.
a little confused.
Yeah, no, but just as my input went up by 10, my output only went up by 2.5.
Yeah. Okay.
So 4 times 2.5 is 10. If my input went up by
That's
10,
what I-
my output went up by 2.5. That's 10 over 2.5 is 4 over 1. Done.
Okay.
You got it. Okay. And again, which one represents most gain here? Well, 50 in was 95 out. 70 in was 97 out. My God, this is the last example. Whoa, whoa. As my input increased by 10, my output increased by 1.
So that's a 10 to 1.
Correct. Done. 10 to 1. We're done. That's how you
I have
read
a question.
graph. That's how you read input-output functions. Okay?
I have a
So
question
can talk.
on your number 10 question.
Yes. You want me to go to it?
No,
Okay.
I'm curious because it says that your system does not work well for inputs below 50 dB SPL.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
because of ambient noise being around,
Correct.
didn't you do real ear in a booth
Yeah. If your
to prevent
system,
the ambient noise?
no, because if your system doesn't really work very well for soft sounds like that, then why do it? But this was a question saying, well, what would the gain be if I can't really measure it with my real ear system? I can't really measure it because the ambient noise of the room itself is 40, so I can hardly measure what the hearing aid's doing. But what would the gain be? And without using real ear, you can figure it out. That's all. You're never going to
Okay.
be doing this.
Okay.
You're never going to be doing this. It's not something the HIS is doing on a daily basis. The purpose here is academic, getting people to wrap their heads around input-output functions. Just that's the purpose.
Gotcha.
The question was meant to be a snake oil question. It was meant to be a dirty question. I mean, but it just forces you to internalize the rules of input-output functions. That's all it's meant to do is okay? You're not going to be
Okay,
messing
well, let
with
me
that.
ask you this then.
Yes.
We had a patient in clinic the other day whose MCL was only 5, maybe 10 dB less than his UCL,
What?
and he was very severely hard of hearing.
Okay, that makes
So,
sense.
In
Yeah.
that case, where would you set an MPO for someone like that who's
What
that
was his
severe?
UCL?
I mean, a
What was-
hearing aid is only going, but it was like 90,
That's very, you know what?
and his MCL was like 80.
I'm suspicious of that. I'm very suspicious of that. I'll tell you why. UCL is very, very instruction oriented. It's a very subjective measure. So is MCL. If I say to you, Let me know what your most comfortable loudness is. Okay, now tell me when my voice gets too loud. Wrong. Wrong way to do it. I would say this. What do you think about this loud? I'd come in at 60. What do you think of this loud? No, it's not loud enough. I'd come in at 70. How about there? No, it's not loud enough. I'd come in at about 75 or 80. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. I'd come in then at 90. No, that's too loud. I'd come in at then 85. What do you think of that? And then I'd come in at 75. What do you think of that? I'd ask them like Goldilocks to, If I was your radio and you had to listen to me all day, God forbid, set me at a volume that you think is just right. Okay, that's how what I do. Now UCL. I want to turn up my voice to a loudness that you don't want to listen to for any length of time. Now don't be a wuss. Don't raise your hand when I'm a little bit louder than what you want. And on the other hand, don't be macho and let your ears bleed. Okay? Raise your hand when my voice reaches a loudness that you wouldn't want to tolerate for any length of time. That one. I'm going to go up by 5 dB steps. I'll bet you dollars to donuts I would have gotten the guy to 100 at least. I'm very suspicious of a severe hearing loss having a UCL of 90. That's usually not the case. I've never seen that before. If their thresholds are around 80, their UCLs are usually no lower than 100. Usually, I find UCLs. They need everything they can get.
I could be right. I could be wrong about that number. It was very close, though, is what I remember. That it was like within 5 to 10 dB of each other.
Not much, yeah. Well, remember when you get a big hearing loss or any hearing loss is always like the floor is elevating, but the ceiling is staying largely the same. Okay, UCLs vary a little bit among people, not much. Hearing thresholds do. So if your thresholds meet your ceiling, you're deaf. Okay, that's what deaf sign language is. Right. And as I said before, if you yell into a deaf person's ear, he's going to wind up and punch you in the side of the head because it hurts him exactly like it would hurt you. The trouble is he can't hear anything softer. He can't hear anything until it hurts. So he has no dynamic range. He's got no range. And that's what's happening in your client with a severe hearing loss. His thresholds are 80 and maybe his UCL's like 100. So his dynamic range is only 20. So he's going to use high power hearing aids with output limiting compression. He's going to be using the hearing aid as soon as the output hits around 115, 120 dB SPL, because you're adding 15 to 20 to his UCL. As soon as the hearing aid hits an output like that, it's slamming on the brakes. So you'll be using output limiting compression for that person. And your software will likely automatically choose that type of compression. Right. Because you entered his thresholds and UCLs and everything like that. Your software is going to do a lot of this for you. But you, as a clinician, should know what's kind of going on underneath the veneer. So actually what's happening is the knee point's probably pretty high and the compression ratio is really high, I'll bet you. Bet you dollars to donuts. It's output limiting compression happening here. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Adios. Next week, we'll cover more WDRC and output limiting, but more clinical applications of it and stuff. And we'll be summarizing. Next week, we're kind of taking this stuff home. And then we're nearing the end of the compression stuff in your course.
When will quiz 1 be due then?
I would say quiz 1.
When will quiz 1 be due?
Quiz 1 should be done by the end of let's see, what's today, the 12th? What's the date today?
Yeah,
let's say just quiz 1 should be done by next week, by a week from now at least. Because now you can answer quiz 1. You can answer quiz 1 with your hands tied behind your back. No problemo. I expect everybody to get straight A's on their quiz, like everything, because now it's going to be easy peasy Japanesey. All right? So we got a little bit more on compression, but not much. You've weathered the hardest part, actually. So this is you've weathered the hardest part. Now, from now on, it's more descriptive.
Yeah, this was good today because those questions, I'd gone over them and I had a lot of question marks. Some of it I understood.
Yeah.
But now the light bulb kind of went on.
Good. Can you see how an active online program like this is so much better than sitting there?
Yeah, reading a book, you just don't.
Oh, you can't.
Yeah.
I agree. I would hate to learn this stuff by pure online. I would hate it. And that's what IHS does. It's all online. It's purely online.
Tina's lucky. She gets to go to clinics. I haven't had any clinics or practicum in my what is it, the ethics and stuff.
Yeah.
I had to write on an infection control thing, and I'm like, oh. So I just went and watched a YouTube video. I didn't know what else to do, and just from there on it.
It's harder for you. That's true, because you're not in Springfield, but you're gonna get it though. You will get it.
So
Have faith.
I'm hoping to find some practicum or something.
Yeah. Here's hoping you get a practicum in Boise. That would be great.
Yeah, I talked to someone at one of those places, and he was referring me to someone out in the Idaho area.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they have anyone in this area, but
I sure hope so, for you and your husband's sake. I mean, you got to be able to. Well, I'll stop recording here anyway. We can chat.